Welcome everyone. Tonight is our first live event for Animate Earth. So thank you so much for coming. It's really lovely to see you all. We're really interested here at looking at the relationship between us as humans and the rest of the natural world, whether that means the things that we can see or the things that we can't see. So we are taking the starting assumption that everything around us is alive and intelligent and ensouled. And if that's the case, then how do we find ways of re-establishing our communication with that? It's a belief that all of our ancestors had till not so very long ago. So we have various sources of information to pull on when we're looking at this question of communication. Those come in the form of myths and story, in lineages of magical traditions that have been passed from old times, in indigenous traditions around the world, and in literary traditions as well. So we're looking at all of these things as we're trying to re-establish ways of reconnecting ourselves in ways that are really relevant for us now. And we are starting tonight with divination because this is a very ancient practice of starting this conversation with all that is. So we're really excited to have with us two magical practitioners, I would call them. The first is Colin Campbell, who's coming to us from South Africa. And those of you that know Colin know that his work is absolutely other and amazing. He's one of the lineage holders for the sound traditions of the African countries. And he will be doing a live divination tonight. And also we have Angharad Wynne with us from the British Isles, who comes from the Brythonic tradition.
Thank you, Rachel. And wow, welcome everyone. It's always still a bit of a crazy thing for me to be meeting everybody here in virtual space on a screen. But I'm gradually getting used to it. So what I'd like to do, we're going to invoke the traditions that I grew up in, was lucky enough to grow up in, our ancestral traditions. So we speak about ancestors as a kind of a bigger context of self, would be another way of expressing it in Western terms. So one of the things we do whenever we gather and we do ceremony or ritual or just talking together about deep things is we invoke the ancestors among us. So that means all our ancestors. It means everyone here has ancestors, belongs to lineages of ancestors. So we invoke them in a general way. What I'd like you to do is maybe just to close your eyes for a second and imagine yourself in the context of your ancestors. Imagine standing behind you, of course, the gateway to your ancestors, your mother and your father, to the left and to the right of you. And behind them, your grandparents, your mother's mother, your mother's father, your father's mother, your father's father. And behind them, your great-grandparents. And behind them, your great-great-grandparents. And your great-great-great-grandparents going back. Each lineage, each level of your lineage expanding in terms of the numbers. So we have 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, 16 great-great-grandparents, 32, 64, 128, 256, 512, 1,024. And so it goes on, exponentially increasing in the numbers of people who are part of your ancestral field, if you like. So just be aware of those people all the way back. And then, of course, beyond the people, before the people, because the world didn't begin with people, you then become related to the animals, the plants, the birds, all the creatures that roam the earth, the insects, and then rivers and mountains, rocks, and finally the earth itself. And then further out into space, the stars, the galaxies, the universe in its entirety, right at the base of your ancestry. So you're by fundamental link related to absolutely everything through the lineages of your ancestors. So just feel that context, just hold it as you sit where you are now.
Thank you, Colin.
Beautiful. Thank you, Colin.
Angharad, before we begin then, I'm going to come to you and ask you to talk a little bit about the context of divination.
Well, I might do a little bit more of that after kind of Colin has thrown. I know that Colin will be explaining a little bit of what he's doing as he goes, but just really because I know as we've got lovely familiar faces from our different kind of courses and adventures, we also have a lot of new faces here tonight, and you are very welcome. And because I'm imagining it might be a little discombobulating to land in this space and go into the kind of talk that we're going to do about divination without setting a little bit of context, I just wanted to just say a little bit about divination in this very specific animist context, in that we think of it not so much as fortune telling, but as a ceremony, as a meeting point between the divine and the seeker. We understand divination as, or the means of divination as, a set of agreed tools and symbols that are meaningful, that we can have a conversation with the all that is. And as you heard Rachel kind of talk about earlier, in the terms of animism, we believe in an animate world, in a ensouled world. So we believe that animals, plants, all living things, and all those things that are made from living things have spirit and have some agency and have some means of communicating with us. And it doesn't really matter if you come to us from a specific religion. Animism can sit as a philosophy alongside religions. It's not a religion as such. It is a spirituality. It is a philosophy. It's a way of seeing the world. And here, just in Britain and in Northern Europe, we lived quite happily as Catholic animists, at least until the 17th century, and then the time of Enlightenment, when science kind of sucked away that sense of the magical, that sense of an ensouled natural world. And so we come to divination with that kind of context. Who is speaking tonight doesn't matter so much. You're very welcome to hold your own sense of who that is. But the one thing that I will say is that the wisdom of the tradition of divination and of diviners says that it's no accident that you have turned up here tonight. At some deep level, you haven't turned up because you wanted to hear Colin and I talk about divination. At some level, your ancestors or spirit or higher power has called you to a divining, to a conversation with the all that is, to a listening, to a point of meeting. And we see kind of Colin's role in this tonight as the intermediary, as the portal, as the facilitator of that conversation. And I'm not going to say more just now, just to give you that kind of, I suppose, some kind of ground on which to stand on, and hopefully to welcome you all in. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Colin to show us divination in practice, in the knowledge that we now understand a little bit of what it is, and that we come to it with the reverence that this moment deserves. Thank you very much, and I'll see you after the bones. Colin.
Thank you, Angharad. Yes, so one of the things that we find ourselves having to do when we gather as a group like this in these modern times is compress things into very small spaces, things that are big. So when we're discussing matters like this of divination, as we call it in the English language, it's a very, very big thing. And we find ourselves trying to make it small so that we can discuss it in a short period of time. But nonetheless, with the help of the ancestors, maybe we can condense it sufficiently to give ourselves a reasonable sense of it as we gather here tonight. Many of you will probably have encountered in divination or be diviners yourselves in your own ways, because divination is something that happens all over the world, absolutely everywhere, in its different ways. And all cultures at one time practiced this, what we would call an art, I guess. It's more than an art, though. So what I'm going to just introduce you to this evening is, you know, when missionaries first came to Southern Africa and they were wandering around among traditional people doing their work, they encountered, to many of their astonishments, the interesting things that traditional people did. And among them was this strange habit of often sitting in the village under a specific tree and bringing out objects and doing some kind of a performance. They wouldn't really understand it because it was in another language, and the way things worked were a bit foreign and difficult, but they wrote about it. So we have these writings about the first people from Europe who came here and described this thing that people did, where they took out objects and they threw them on the ground with incantations and interesting talk and poetic sounding language, and then the great discussions would evolve around them, because people would gather from the village to hear what these objects had to say. And when the missionaries looked at them, they said, oh, it's very interesting. They seem to have animal bones in them, among many other things, but they became generically referred to thereafter as the bones. The bones is not really a very good way of describing these objects at all. The traditional way is ditaula in Setswana. This system of practice comes from southeastern Botswana predominantly, which is where I mostly grew up. I grew up in different parts of Botswana, but most of my growing up was in southeastern Botswana, in a time when I was lucky enough still to be able to be growing up among traditional people in a traditional community, going through many of the initiations that traditional people went through, and also going through a process of learning to become a diviner and going through the initiations of being a diviner over about a 15-year period when I was a child and into my teens. During this time, you know, I was introduced to the whole cosmology, because to be a diviner is to be a carrier of the cosmology, is to be a story holder. Because divination in the end is a story, it's a narrative, and it fundamentally sits at the core level of the core narrative of the culture that it represents. And most forms of divination have a system of containing that, which is usually in poetic form. The reason being that poems are the only way really of incorporating the riddles that come back to us in our queries that we put out to the universe, if we use the language of our Western way, or the ancestors, if we were talking from the perspective of an ancestral culture. The ancestors is another way of saying the universe in a certain sense, because the ancestors are everyone and everything. Ultimately, we can be specific about it in terms of certain people, we can be specific about it in terms of certain animals, or we can be general and say we're related to absolutely everything, and that's the ancestors. So when we put questions out there to the ancestors, either in specific form or general form, we get riddles back. And these riddles are poems. Maboko, they're called in Setswana. And these poems are complex and deeply rooted in the cosmology of the culture, and more importantly, deeply rooted in the natural world within which that culture lives. So the natural world essentially is the expression of the cosmology. It's the way that the cosmology organizes itself in imaginal form. So we are imaginal creatures as human beings. We imagine, we work with images. It's one of those things, either internally or externally, projected in the form of symbologies and so on. But the image is really what we work with. So when we go into nature, our imaginal mind essentially reflects back at us from the natural world, which reflects, according to traditional people, our deep inner nature. So there's a resonance. There's a reflective resonance between nature out there and nature in here. And the ultimate balance and interactive way of nature is reflected internally in the balances and interactions within ourselves. And there's a deep and fundamentally inextricable relationship between the two. It's not a divided world, it's an intermingled world. The internal and the external are intermingled. But the fundamental base of who we are, according to traditional people, and this has always been the case, is reflected in nature as nature is. So in the old days, there would be the world of the village. And the world of the village is where people lived and where people interacted. And it was things of people. You build houses, you have the brewing place, you have the butcher's place, you have, all the different components of what being human means. And then beyond the bounds of the village, you move into the grazing lands of the livestock. And then beyond that, you move into deep nature. And deep nature was understood to be the expression of life in its purest and most profound and balanced form. And it has its own world and its own law in the LORE sense. And all law that was made by humans had to be fundamentally informed by that great law that is the law of nature. Now it's interesting because relatively recently, the cultural historian and theologian Thomas Berry was quoted as saying that nature represents the primary text. In other words, there are all these sacred texts that we have, and these texts are texts that we go to kind of ask questions about the universe, life, existence, the way we are, who we are, where we come from. So what Berry said was, if we want to really know that truly, then we go back to nature, because it is from her that we all come, ultimately. And it is to her that we return, fundamentally. And it is to her that we are fundamentally and inextricably and ultimately related and reflected. And so if we want to know anything about ourselves, we can go into nature and we can query anything. And we will find that there is, if we understand the language, in other words, if we are able, in inverted commas, to read the primary text, we will understand what nature has to say. Traditional people would have said exactly the same thing, funnily enough. And in southeastern Botswana, what they would say is that there's another way of doing this as well, and that is, and it goes with a big creation story that hopefully one day I have the opportunity to tell you. It takes about 3 days to tell you. But in that creation story, we find out how it was that nature gave us these objects as a representation of all the different components of herself. And we were told by nature in very different ways, by each of the animals, by each of the plants, by the hills, by the mountains, by the rivers, how it is that we should represent them within this collection of objects. And so the lion gave a finger, and the baboon gave an elbow, and the elephant gave a little piece of his foot and her foot, because we have a male and a female elephant, and the marula tree gave their pips from their fruit, and so on. The crocodile, a stone from her stomach, and all these objects come together as ditaula, the law. Kolaula means to control. It means to apply the law. Nature controls us. Nature brings about, it is within nature's law that we ultimately live. But of course, the old stories tell us that, well, one of the things that we did was we stole fire from nature. And there's a whole story about how that happened. And the creator, the great creator of all creatures and all things, took us aside and said, listen, you've stolen fire. Now you're in deep trouble, actually. But since you've done it, let it be your destiny. But know this, in stealing fire, you separate yourself from nature. So forever you will be living in separation, and you're going to have to find your way back to connection with nature, because fire has separated you, because it's a very powerful medicine, and whoever possesses it, they are not directly part of nature. So there's this whole way in which we seemingly, from time immemorial, have this image at the heart of being human, of being separated somehow from nature, and of needing, through our practices, through our way of living, through our communicative processes, and through our relational building, to find our way back into some fundamental connection with nature. And divination is at the heart of that. Divination gives the directive of how to do that, how to restore, how to return to that fundamental relatedness within ourselves that stretches into and intermingles within the rest of nature. So that's really the context of where it sits. Now, we thought tonight that it would be kind of fun to kind of introduce you to the, as the missionaries call it, the bones, as we call it, di taula, those of the law, the L-O-R-E. So I'm going to do that to you, for you, and just show you a little bit, just a very, very, very mild, small little taste of how the bones work. Hopefully we'll have the opportunity in time, I don't know if the universe permits, for us to sit in deep conversation about divination and the bones and all these, because I could spend 3 or 4 weeks with you, and we could spend every day from dusk all the way through till dawn, and then from midday through back till dusk and so on, just talking about the bones and throwing the bones and looking at the poems and configuring them and interacting with the universe in this way and calling the ancestors into them. But for tonight, we'll just have a taste. So these are the bones, the taula. And what traditional people say is, when I hold them like this, I hold the universe in my hands. So a diviner is tasked with holding the universe in her or his hands. People would ask you, well, how do you find all these bones? Well, with great difficulty, because you can't go out and hunt any of these animals and assume that that's going to then form part of your bones. They must come to you. The animal must come to you. The animal must give it to you. That's a really tough business. The first thing that it requires is that you live deeply in the place where they come from, where these animals are, where this great wilderness is. And you need to learn as you go fundamentally how to relate to that place. You learn the directions of the winds. You learn the movements of the clouds. You learn the way the trees move in certain winds. There's certain kinds of winds. There are different qualities of winds. You learn the animals, their different calls. They call at different times of day. You learn the bird calls. You learn their sounds. You learn what they're saying. You learn to read the primary text. And as you learn to read the primary text, you learn how to transpose those into the symbolic representations that are the bones. And thus you learn to become a diviner. That's how you become a diviner. So a diviner is in a sense somebody who shows the road to deep connection. And the bones themselves show the road to deep connection. What we're in search of, what we're chasing, what we're after here is fundamentally deep connection. We're finding our place, once again, in inextricable connection with absolutely everyone. And I say everyone because in an animate universe, there's no such thing as a thing. Everyone is somebody. Whether it's a teacup or a teaspoon that you buy from the local supermarket, whether it's a chair that you sit on, whether it's the hyena out in the wilderness, whether it's the great mountains out there, the oceans, the stars above, everyone is someone. And therefore, we have a fundamental capacity to relate to them because we're relating to someone. And that means that we have this potential for fundamental and very deep relationship. So the taula, the law, really is a system, a way back to deep relationship, back to fundamental relationship. So now we ask ourselves, okay, so what poem are you telling us now? And we start to look at the configurations because this system comes from a collective culture, which means everything is contextual. Nothing has meaning on its own. Everything has meaning by dint of its relationship with everything around it and everything else. That's the nature of a collective culture. So what we find ourselves in these modern times, in increasingly individualistic cultures, is inculcating a deep feeling of isolation. And the deep feeling of isolation simply comes from this notion of I am myself. I am myself, it has its advantages, but the disadvantages of it are that we begin to see ourselves as an encapsulation among other things, rather than a relationship between everything. So ultimately, a collective culture would see me as a relationship between everything, and you as a relationship between everything. And those relationships move and are constantly in motion together, and they are dancing, and they are expressing, and they are creating, and they are co-creating. And that's how a collective culture would understand. And all cultures, by the way, pre-industrially, were collective to one degree or another. And the further back you go, the more collective we were. And not only were we collective as a human collective, but we were collective within the entirety of existence. We were collective with the stars, we were collective with the rest of nature, we were collective with everything. We've become increasingly isolated, that is, separated. And traditional people here say that that is because we stole fire in the beginning, and now, more recently, we've forgotten the practices that used to return us back to that relationship. We used to have those practices. We were given those practices by nature herself at one time. We used to live them, we used to do them. And in so doing, we return to our sense of belonging, our sense of commune with the rest of creation. As Thomas Berry would say, we found our place in the communion of subjects, rather than being an isolated component in a collection of objects, which is how we tend to see ourselves in an individualistic way. So in a way, it takes us back to commune. And we had practices constantly that we did that. And also we lived in very deep proximity with nature herself. So the idea of living in some kind of distanced or severed relationship with nature would not have been part of our way of being at one time. And so we live in an unprecedented time at the moment, and the unprecedented nature of the time simply is that we live in ultimate dislocation. We live in an ultimate expression of this fundamental disconnection that took place when we stole fire. And we live in that position because of the loss of the practices that used to return us to nature. And so traditional people here say that the task is to rediscover those practices, to find them again, to start practicing them, because in doing that, we begin the reparation, we begin to repair the severance, we begin to bring ourselves back to the natural world. And divination, traditional people here say, is one of the most profound ways of finding the path, finding the road back to so-called, what we might call wholeness, back to this total sense of relatedness. So the poem that comes today, now it's very interesting. Okay, so this poem, first of all, let's contextualize it. I'm going to contextualize it by saying that the north in Botswana is the generative direction. So why is it the generative direction? Well, quite simply because if you face north in Botswana, you're facing towards the equator. And you're facing towards the verdant equatorial forest regions of Central Africa. And over that region, there's a weather condition that hangs. And it's called the intertropical zone of convergence, because what happens is winds blow up from the Antarctic and they come up across the subcontinent of Africa and they move up towards the equator. And round about the equator, they meet the warm, moist air coming up out of the forest regions and the rivers and so on of that area. And that warm, moist air is drawn by the cold, icy winds of the south, and it precipitates, it brings rain. And that intertropical zone of convergence in summer comes south. It moves down across the subcontinent, comes to rest over Botswana, and that's how we get our rain. So what we understand is the rain comes from the north, and the north is this place of verdance. And in the winter, in the old days, before border fences and cordon fences and all the other fences that have been put up, the animals used to migrate from Botswana all the way up through the subcontinent into Zimbabwe, into Angola, into Mozambique, and then north, all the way up into the Congo region and the equatorial regions of Africa. And they used to graze there during the winter, and then they'd come all the way back to Southern Africa in the summer. So as the summer approached, the animals would be coming back from the north. So the north is this generative direction. Now, this poem is oriented to the north. And therefore, we can say immediately it's a generative poem. It's got potency. So now let me try and translate the poem for you in English so that you can see if you can make sense of it. Unfortunately, it's going to be a little stulted because translation is a tricky business at the best of times, and from these poems, even more tricky. But let me do my best. It says, travel. Now, it's interesting because here we sit in these very difficult times, and we sit with most of us conundrums that we're trying to solve, because of economic systems and because of political systems and because of climate changings and because of technological craziness and all the stuff that's going on in the world. And we're at this very, very tricky and difficult passage in our history as human beings, in fact, in our history as a planet. And we find ourselves sitting here scratching our heads in worry and saying, what's going to happen? How do we navigate these times? What do we do with them? How do we respond to them? What are we supposed to do? Are things going to change so fundamentally that we're going to be utterly lost and destroyed? Well, we can understand that any fundamental change is a passage, and any passage is tenuous. So the more profound it is, the more fundamental it is, the more tenuous it is. We know that. So in traditional times, being born was a very tenuous passage. Moving from a young child to a middle child was a very tenuous passage. Childhood was a very tenuous passage. Moving from child to adult was a tenuous passage. So the understanding is that as we go through these fundamental changes, either as an individual or as a collective, these are passages and they're changed. There are times when change intensifies, when there's an amplification of everything, and when, in a certain sense, our existence at some level is put on probation. And are we going to make it or not? The only way to make it is to transform fundamentally. If the child doesn't become an adult, she doesn't survive. If the child is not born, she doesn't survive. So it's born or die. Move into this fundamental change or die. And as a humanity, I would suggest to you, we kind of sit in that situation right now. We're in this tenuous position. Are we going to make it through this passage? Because we're fundamentally changing. The world is fundamentally changing. And we look about us in horror because the change is so fundamental. It's so radical. And it's so impactful on absolutely every last aspect of what being alive means right now. That's a passage. And for the first time, perhaps, I don't know, but it's likely for the first time that we look upon ourselves as a global system. Now, the mythologist Joseph Campbell suggests that the first time that really happened was when we first saw the image of the entire Earth from space in 1968. And then in 1969, when we had the first images of the Earth rising above the plains of the moon coming back to us, he said there was a fundamental psychic shift within, or psychospiritual shift even, or mythic shift within humanity. We, instead of seeing ourselves as these disparate little collectives in our little places, we began to see ourselves in terms of a globe. The idea of the Earth came into being. So that in itself, Campbell suggested was unprecedented, and maybe that's true. But we transformed in that moment, and we continue to move through that transformation now as a globe, and we go through the fundamental changes that are occurring as part of that. And the question, will we make it, is in the minds of pretty much everyone, I think, particularly at the moment, and more increasingly as time goes by. Now, this poem comes to us in the midst of all of this alone. What does that mean? Does that mean we walk alone? Does that mean we are in isolation? No, it actually doesn't. Because when in the Tswana tradition somebody says, this is yours alone, it means walk it, it belongs to you, it's yours, it's a blessing. So actually, now this is a happy thing, because the bones can be very acerbic and they can be very critical, and they can prognose doom and gloom. Anyone who knows divination knows that. So when you get a blessing in divination, you kind of sit back and you heave a sigh of relief, because it's a great thing. And in these times, it's moderately rare as well, because divination tends to be wagging its finger at you a lot right now. But anyway, this particular poem is extremely positive. And it says, you who are hearing, you the inquirer, because we're all considered the inquirers as we sit here now. We could consider ourselves all gathered under the tree. In the traditional way, you know, divination, somebody would come with a question usually, and the diviner would get out her or his bones, and they would throw the bones. And one of the things about a collective culture is nothing is private. So it's out under the tree in the middle of the village, and anybody passing by says, the bones are being read, let's go and see. And everybody gathers around, and you might very soon you have a big crowd, and you're busy pouring your heart out to the diviner, and the diviner is busy divining for you, and all the deepest, darkest secrets are there for everybody to see and hear. And then the poems come, and by the way, most people would have known the poems in traditional times. And so the diviner chants the poem, and then a voice comes from over there and says, yeah, you know what? That poem, I know my grandfather used to say that poem. It doesn't quite go the way you say it. This is the way it goes. And then he chants the poem. And then somebody else over here says, no, no, no. My grandmother also knew that poem. And so you now get different versions of the poem coming, because there are always, the poems are living things, these particular poems. So they're adapted, they move, they change, they have their own life, and they find their own expression in the time. So even as I speak these poems now, although they're extremely old, and we don't even know when they first came into being, but what we do know about them is that as they move through time, they adapt, they change, they morph, they accommodate. So this poem then, well, it's a very profound poem in that it's this blessing, and it's the northerly aspect of which has a fertility to it. So we can sit back and say, well, at least as a group here, as we sit now, we're being given a blessing by the ineffable. And we're being told, you know what, you know how to be human. You know deeply how to be human. Merely remember it. So when the poem says, call a wedding, call a marriage, a wedding and a marriage is a deep symbolic enactment of relatedness. So it's not just the getting together of two people in the holy matrimony as we might see it today. Unfortunately, what we sit with when we translate is words in English which have very specific meanings. But unfortunately, we have a bit of a paucity of words in English to translate into from a language which has many, many hundreds of thousands more words for things. So we have to kind of squash them into words that are, you know, that are a bit tricky for us, because marriage is a very specific word, whereas the word in Setswana for the same thing is a much bigger word. It's much, much bigger, and it has existential qualities to it, which the word marriage doesn't have. So when it says call a marriage, it's an existential expression of deep relatedness. It says, your relatedness is inherent. Remember it. To call is to remember, because you call from behind in an ancestral culture, remembering that perfection lies behind in an ancestral collection. There was perfection back there, and our task is to get back to that perfection. That's different from the way we see it in modern culture, which sees perfection as somewhere out ahead of us, and we've got to strive to become that in the future in some way. So in that sense, calling a marriage is in a way saying, call back that sense of relatedness that you know. And then it says, do the things you do. You know, have for yourself children one by one, which is your creative impulse. Be creative, do the creative things you do. Because those creative things, because this is a northerly aspected thing, because the blessing of the road is yours, it's something that's given to you as a blessing. Do it as you do it. So, and then it says, call a binding of two lineages. Now, the image I want to give you is this. Maybe as children you did this as well, but if you take a tin and you fill it with water, and then you punch two holes in the bottom of it, you'll get two streams of water as it flows. But if you're clever and you take it, you can take your fingers and you twist it, and it'll come together as one, and it'll flow as one. That's the image I want you to have in these terms. When you bind lineages, so when you bind lineages, a very profound thing is happening. So what is happening is a third component is always made. So a relationship is 2 plus 1. 2, this and that, and 3, the spirit of the relationship itself. There are three spirits there. So when you call a binding of two lineages, you're creating a third spirit. That's a creative act. So whenever we forge relationship, be that with a tree, be that with a river, be that with another animal, be that with another human being, what we're essentially forming at the same time is we're creating another spirit, the spirit of that relationship. So in doing that, we are creating creation itself. There's a creation that happens out of that. That's what this poem speaks to. It speaks to our fundamental creativity. So we hold a paradox in our hands here, as divination always does. On the one hand, we sit here in terror and trembling saying, oh my God, we as human beings, what have we done? We stole fire, we've forgotten all the practices, we're destroying every darn thing in sight at the moment, we're behaving like teenage children because we're not initiated anymore, etc., etc., etc. And on the other hand, we're being given this poem, which says, do as you've always done. Now, we sit with a conundrum in that. And divination always does this, by the way. It gives you conundrums. It gives you paradoxes. It gives you opposing positions. And if we are to follow the words of Carl Jung, he would say, that is, in his language, the conjunctio oppositorum. That is the meeting of opposites. And the meeting of opposites creates a great attrition. It creates a friction. And if those opposites are allowed to be in friction, in other words, if they're held equally, then a great heat is generated from that. And that heat rises. And in its rising, the two opposites are brought together at a higher level of consciousness, what Jung referred to as the transcendent third component or transcendent third function. So when that happens, there is a coalescence at a higher level of relatedness, where at a lower level of consciousness, it was in opposition. So we see it at a higher level. So in a sense, that motif is also present in this poem. It's expressing that. So I realize I'm now babbling on a lot myself. I've just given you an essence of the poem, an essence of how the bones work, an essence of how the system works. We're going to then move back into talking about divination a bit less specifically, and perhaps also later bringing in some questioning and thinking about it. But what is also important when divination takes place is there's a certain potency that happens. So in the Tswana tradition, it's a quality of spirit, and it's called siriti. Siriti comes. So siriti is a kind of it's an indescribable sense of something. When these poems come into being, when you sit either in front of a Taoist master, or you sit in front of a traditional African master, or you sit in front of a European master, and they chant their poems and they chant their poetry and they do their bardic thing if they're Western Europeans in the ancient traditions, then something happens, because what is happening there is a commune of the universe is taking place. The vultures are circling, the hyenas are calling, and everyone is gathering at that place. And when everyone gathers, a profundity takes place. That's what divination invokes, and that's what we hope we invoke when we divine. So I'm going to end there for the time being, and I'm going to hand back to Angharad and Rachel. Thank you.
Thank you, Colin. Thank you deeply to the ancestors for that guidance and for illuminating why maybe we've been brought here tonight. I want to make sure that we have enough time for questions and discussions at the end. So I'm not going to speak for very long, but I thought it might be useful just to kind of pad this kind of out in terms of some context even further within the bounds of or the way of thinking and the philosophical and spiritual imprint of animism. So I'm going to start with just looking very briefly at the story of humanity and its relationship with divination. And it's long and vast. We humans are questioning beings. And it's likely that, not long after we built fires, gathered around them, shared stories and food, that we started to wonder what might happen in the future. Would the hunters kind of go at their quarry tomorrow? What would kind of the baby that's just been born grow up to be? And you know, the story of divination and humanity probably goes back much further than we can actually understand. Written evidence for it goes back to the early 2nd millennium BC in Mesopotamia, and it's attested throughout the ancient world. Mostly we find kind of reference to it in the Near East, in Egypt, the Levant area, Greece, Italy, and China. And just as an example, the Chinese Book of Changes, which dates to about 1142 BC, details a style of prophesizing that evolved from an even older practice of casting bones into a fire and reading patterns on their charred surface. So kind of looking at kind of the system of throwing the bones that Colin has talked to you about today, you can see how maybe a long time before it developed into that full system, it started off as something as fundamental and as intuitive, really, as that. There's a potency and a magic to words, and so it's worth having a look at what the word divination actually means. It comes from the Latin divinare, which means to foresee or receive messages from the gods. There's a strata of meaning, as I said, to words. They hold all their meanings potently within them, a bit like the strata of land. So I'm going to take us back to the root of divinare now. Now, the name or the noun of the action that is incorporated in the stem of divinare literally means to be inspired by God. Divinus being that bit that means God. Now, if we look back a bit further into the root, what sits beneath this is divus, which means a god. And the root of that word is deus, which means to shine. So if we were to trace the ancestry, if you like, of the word divination, perhaps what we get to is an understanding of divination as being to be inspired by the shining ones, by spirit, or indeed by the essence of life itself.
Now, I know that your work, well, both of your work is about bringing some of these tools into the kind of modern context. Why so important now?
Well, I mean, that's a big question and an important one. And I would go with what a lot of traditional people here say, in that there are a lot of things that we as human beings have learned over all the millennia of our humanness and also from before that. There's a vast amount of what being human means that has been somehow peripherized or thrown aside in these modern times in service to a kind of a retracted version of what being human means, a very mechanized version, a version which reflects predominantly in our physical materiality and our relationship with the physical world. And so the question we sit with, and the question that is posed by traditional elders here, is how do we now go back and find all those parts of what being human means that we've thrown aside and bring them back into being part of who we are now, so that the expanded sense of who we are can come back into full expression. Because part of the reason traditional people here say that we find ourselves in such a space of really being stuck in the sense of what to do with our present condition, they would say is because we're asking the questions of ourselves and each other and our situation from a very small portion of ourselves. And we're deafening ourselves to a much larger portion of ourselves. And that larger portion of ourselves really is expressed as much as anything in our relationship with the rest of nature, all that is other than human, another way of putting it. And we've put this great barrier up between ourselves as a human collective and all that is other than human. And we don't have that access in ourselves equally, because all that is other than human in our exterior world is also represented by a vast component of who we are internally, that in deafening ourselves to that which is other than human outwardly, we're deafening ourselves to that part of ourselves as well, to that aspect of our psyche, which, by the way, is a much bigger part of our psyche than the one that we're currently framing ourselves in. What divination has always helped us do is access that bigger aspect of what being human means, that bigger aspect of our collective context, within which we have vaster perspectives. We have access to levels of consciousness which are much, much wider, bigger, grander, potent, all-inclusive than the one we would tend to have presently. So one way of beginning to reincorporate these parts of ourselves, to find them in the first place, to re-invoke them, to bring them back to life, is to go back and see what practices it is that we've excluded and mostly trivialized. So one of the things that has tended to happen is we've made this huge separation between what we consider to be the reality of our experience versus the imagined nature of our experience, between imagination and reality. It's a big mistake, because in reality there isn't a differentiation between them. They're one and the same thing. They're one great spirit. And the extent to which we separate them into two components, and the extent to which the component we've labeled as imaginal or imaginative, or for that matter, mythic, we've tended to trivialize. We've said, oh, those are primitive stories about ourselves. Now we're enlightened. Since the industrial age, the advent of the industrial age, we now understand the machine of the universe, and we understand its working parts. And sure, out of that comes some miraculous stuff, but unfortunately at the cost of a huge, 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 huge loss. And we're beginning to really experience the repercussions of that loss. So one way back is, what divination represents a way back, because in a way, what divination calls into being is the mythos of what being human means. And the mythos is filled with imagery and with dream and with all the components that can potentially reconstruct a sense of wholeness within ourselves and show us a way back to total relatedness. And in total relatedness, I would suggest to you, and many suggest here, we would begin to find solutions to what seem like impossible situations in our present world. And I would suggest that divination is one of the ways through to that. And we live in a world now where one of the advantages is we have access to cultures of very disparate natures. And we have access to their different expressions of and representations of these old practices. And so we can begin to go and look at them, and we can look at what their commonalities are, what their so-called perennial motifs are. The similarities represent the core nature of who we are, in a sense. And what we find at the heart of all of them is this inextricable sense that our relatedness to the rest of nature is fundamental to who we are, and that some sort of practice needs to be reconstructed in order to repair what has become a severed condition, wherein we're completely separated from that part of ourselves. And divination can show us how to do that. And by the way, divination is innate in us. And that's another thing we don't really recognize as humans now. We imagine that it's, those very few gifted seers who have this kind of capacity to read into things. It's in all of us. It's fundamentally part of who we are. We have that capacity for that language. We can go into nature and we can read nature. And how we do that is by resensitizing ourselves to the language of nature within, the language of nature without. And that is achieved through the practices. And those practices can still very, very simply be practiced, because they're not difficult. They require tenacity, and they require patience, and they require a willingness to embrace. But fundamentally, they're simple. They're fundamental to our nature. They're innate to who we are. and divination can show us how to access them.
Ways.
I might...
You and Angharad have got different ways of divination. Elaine is asking a question here about, or she's talking about Malidoma Some's tradition for Burkina Faso. And I was wondering, how appropriate is it for us to learn under a different tradition to the one we currently find ourselves in? Does it matter? Do we look for the cross-cultural practices? What is it to learn in a specific tradition then?
Yeah, that's a very good question. You know, we have these phobias of division as part of our modernity, and individualistic cultures tend to promote that as a notion that our potency is in our separateness. Actually, our potency is not in our separateness, our potency is in our togetherness. And one of the things that we know is that the most profound growing point of all culture is at the point where cultures meet. So where cultures meet, if it's two cultures or more, whatever it is, at those meeting points, that's a very fertile ground. Out of that, that's where culture grows. Those are the growth points of culture. So where we find ourselves in the world now is that we have loads of cultures meeting. And if we're not afraid of that, if we're not afraid of the otherness of the other, or the difference of ourselves, or of somehow the otherness of the other overwhelming us and taking from us and all these other things that we tend to get bound up with, then we find ourselves in a very, very creative place where the potency of who we are as humans presently, and as who we are in relation to all other creation, where that meeting is happening, there's profound growth potential that is bubbling up out of that. And so, yeah, I would say, you know, we need to embrace this. We need to go for it. And yes, sure, there are dangers inherent to it. You know, we don't want to water things down and genericize things, which is a tendency that can happen. But if we are attending to that, and if we are looking at rigorous practice, and we're looking at rigorous interaction and a care with which we enter into these relatedness with each other, then profundity comes out of that, and growth comes out of that. Profound growth comes out of that. So I would really encourage it.
I just wanted to say thank you so much again for everybody coming. Obviously, we've got a lot of events that have gone up on our Animate Earth platform from through which you came. We're offering 10% off on our events to anybody who signs up on the newsletter at the moment, if you haven't already done that. We're super excited because Colin is coming on a rare trip to this country in about a week or so's time. Yes, this rarely happens. So he's coming to teach on our contemporary animism program, but he is doing one open program in Devon with us called The Magician's Realm, when a lot of this material and a lot of the practices that we've been talking about are going to be looked at in depth, and we get a chance to practice some of those things. So that's one exciting thing. Also, we are just opening an apprenticeship on divination with Colin, which has just come live on our site, and a online program with Angharad as well called Feather, Fire, Stone and Bone, which has just gone live today. So some exciting things that we're super excited about, and just wanted to let you know about if you're at all interested. So thank you for coming. It's been wonderful to have you as our first event. Angharad, I am going to hand over to you to close our space, please.